day in my AP government class, my teacher decided to let us play a game. She handed us dice, paper clips, and cards. She then instructed us to play the game. We looked at her very confused. What were the rules? How do you win? What's the structure and the order? Finally, after a few confusing moments, wondering how we were supposed to play the game, our teacher told us we were replicating a process the founders of the United States of America went through. She said that when they came together to form some type of government, they had all the ingredients for the game, but they needed to create the structure, the order, and the rules. In other words, they had to form a constitution. In our few confusing moments, trying to create the rules to something as simple as a game, we learned how truly difficult it was for our founders to create the doctrine for an entire country. But our founders weren't totally in the dark. For example, every student in my class had played a game before. We had past experience with games which gave us the knowledge to create our own. Our founders used their historical knowledge of 3 categories to craft the Constitution. 1, British doctrines, 2, Enlightenment philosophers, and 3, Confederate failures. There are 2 British doctrines that played a large role in influencing the Constitution we know today, the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Even though the Magna Carta stretches all the way back to the 13th century, its legacy continues on in several noticeable places in our Constitution. For example, the Due Process of Law Clause in our 14th Amendment, as stated by Judge Dillon, is, quote, not new language or language of uncertain meaning. It was taken purposely from Magna Carta. It was, moreover, language which shone resplendent with the light of universal justice. And for these reasons, it was selected to be placed in the 5th Amendment of the Federal Constitution, as it had been placed in the charters of several states. The Due Process of Law Clause in both our 5th and 14th Amendments references the Magna Carta wording of law of the land, which comes from a passage of the Magna Carta that states, no free man shall be taken, or imprisoned, or diseased, or outlawed, or exiled, or anywise destroyed. Nor shall we go upon him, nor send upon him, but by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. This quote sounds familiar because our founders embraced the meaning behind the wording and used it to make their game, or constitution, as solid as possible. The second influential British doctrine was the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Our 8th Amendment is nearly identical to the English Bill when it states, excessive bail ought not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Our founders pulled several more points from this document, but none as exact as seen in our 8th Amendment. Our freedom to petition, given to us by our First Amendment, comes from the English Bill of Rights. But our founders noted that this document was silent on religious freedom. Our founders were very adamant about a freedom of religion, and the benefit of having past examples to draw from enabled our founders to pick and choose the best material to put into our Constitution. It also allowed them to add that which did not have a historical precedent. Secondly, our founders used the ideas of Enlightenment philosophers to create a government better than any they had ever known. The philosophies of John Locke and Montesquieu are interwoven into our Constitution. Locke advocated for every human's right to life, liberty, and property, which is something we hear echoed in our Declaration of Independence and implied in our Bill of Rights. Montesquieu was a proponent of separation of powers. The first 3 articles of the Constitution describe exactly how the American government would uphold this ideology. Our framers decided they would keep a separate and balanced government by forming 3 branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Each branch would have specific duties as well as responsibility to check the power and actions of the other 2. Finally, Confederate failures, as seen with the Articles of Confederation, prompted our founders towards a more resilient doctrine. The Articles of Confederation were very weak. The national government had little power. There was no court system, no executive system, and each state had only 1 vote, regardless of state population. But even as the Articles of Confederation began to crumble, strong, determined Americans came together to form a more perfect union. They learned from the mistakes of the past, and so they strengthened the national government. They created an executive system and a court system, and they compromised between large and small states. Numbers in the House of Representatives would be based on state population, but in the Senate, in a nod of fairness to all, numbers will be composed of 2 members from each state. In many ways, the failures of the first written agreement and Constitution were much more influential than the British doctrines or the Enlightenment philosophers. This failure showed the world the flexibility of the new nation of the United States of America, and it showed the commitment its citizens had towards creating a lasting document that would survive and adapt with the times. This speech for you today isn't just a history lesson. Currently, the American people are facing several contentious issues: immigration reform, the Syrian refugee crisis, and administrative misuse, to list a few. As citizens, it is our duty not just to create solutions to these problems, but to ensure we know our history so that we do not repeat its errors. Theodore Roosevelt once stated, "I believe the more you know about the past, the better you are prepared for the future." The United States Constitution isn't just in agreement with these words, but it was born from our past with the intention of creating a better future. This is a process that has set us up to being one of the only long-lasting, thriving federal systems out of the 25 others in this world. As citizens, we need to mirror the dedication our founders had when they created the Constitution. We need to study past failures and successes before we embark on new ventures or set new standards. When I was trying to create the rules to my game, I first recalled the things I'd experienced as fun and entertaining before combining those elements to make the best game possible. Our founders did just that, but on a larger, much more complex scale. As citizens, we need to continue to study our history. This includes knowing our Constitution, but also knowing where its ideas came from and which stories prompted its articles and amendments. Today, you'll be leaving this room with a small piece of your past. But how will you use that to form a better future? You could be like undergraduate student Gregory Watson when he researched American history and stumbled across an amendment that had failed to be ratified by enough states. Watson then led a 10-year campaign on that amendment, and it was ratified over 200 years after it had been written. Watson is a great example of a citizen who researched his history, and the result is a future where members of Congress could not receive a pay raise until after the next election. Our history doesn't define us, but it can make us stronger. The United States Constitution is the most prominent example of a history well utilized. Our founders used the British doctrines as dice, the Enlightenment philosophers as paperclips, and the Confederate failures as the cards they were dealt. The United States Constitution has shown that, like the quote says, it's not about the cards you're dealt, but how you choose to play the hand. In the creation of our Constitution, you could say Americans were being dealt some pretty bad cards. But if anything, that only made American citizens more determined to create the rules of how they could play their hand. The result is a Constitution that has spanned over 226 years. It may not be as old as the Magna Carta or the English Bill of Rights, but it is alive and central to Americans today in ways those documents will never be. It is our duty as citizens to ensure this trend continues for the future. Thank you.